So, Oren, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me in your chat, guys. I'm excited to just shoot the shit.
That's absolutely what this is. And just to recap, everyone, the way that this started out was Juanmi and I having coffee, talking about work, movies, DPs that we loved, work that they've done, and wishing that we could invite them into our kind of bi-monthly conversations. So
And here we are.
here we
I
are.
love it. This is really cool, guys. It's a really nice format. So yeah, lay it on me. What do we want to talk about? Global
Okay, we're
politics
gonna
or
start
no?
with yeah. Let's
Yes.
talk about that first. No, we were first of
Start
Yeah.
all,
light.
where do you come from? What's your background? How did you get to be a DP?
Well, there's the short version and the long version, and I think for the sake of being able to talk about other things, I'll give the short version. But basically, I started out as a cinephile child, which was I just inhaled movies from a very young age, and it's everything you would expect: Spielberg, Back to the Future, Jurassic Park, Star Wars, of course. And at the same time, I was very actively into making art. I was a big drawer, got into painting. At some point, thought I would be a fine artist, and even kind of went to a middle school that focused on fine arts. But filmmaking was always there, and a love of movies was always there. And the two kind of ended up converging when I discovered the term cinematographer, which was probably a little late by modern standards, but at the time, I think the first time I heard it was on the behind the scenes DVD of The Lord of the Rings, the special features, which I think really inspired a generation of filmmakers. I hear that a lot, like other people bringing up the Lord of the Rings DVD box set. Anyway, once I kind of found that path, I never looked back really, and went to film school. I went to NYU Tisch and focused on cinematography pretty much right away and started shooting as many student films as I could. And that was 14 years ago, and now we're here. So yeah,
That's
that's the whole
incredible.
story.
Do you have do you remember what was like the first real short where like you guys had a crew, not just like a student film or anything, but like you're out of school, the first kind of narrative project, like vivid memories, or kind of what was the setup? Was it like 5D days? Because that's what I
Oh,
remember.
well, it's funny. I in middle school and high school, we had a film program in my high school, which is I think really rare. I mean, this was like 2003. It was very, rudimentary, but it was still cool. And as someone who was kind of just discovering filmmaking as a passion and as an art form that I wanted to pursue, like it was a really crazy opportunity to be able to start practicing it. And at that time, I also bought a bunch of books. Like the first thing you do, I think at that age when you discover it is like, all right, go online. What are the filmmaking books? Like, what are the ones people recommend that you have to get? So I had like the 5 C's of cinematography. Do you have it? Yep. I have it in the other room. And there was this one called Directing Shot for Shot. It's like this blue book with hands, great basics. And then there's a book that's just called Cinematography, Blaine Brown, I think. That one went over my head mostly at the time. But in this class in high school, we covered like all the basics, like wide shot, medium shot, close up, long lens, medium lens, wide lens, that kind of stuff. So really, really basic stuff. But we had access to cameras. Now at the time, it was mini DV. That was where technology was. And in order to download the footage to edit, you'd have to plug in the camera by Firewire to a MacBook, or not a Mac, sorry, a Mac, like an old school Macintosh, and then hit play on the camera and capture all of your clips like in real time off of the tape into the editing software, and then chop them up and put them in a timeline. I weirdly miss those days. I mean, I shouldn't, but it's nostalgic for me. And actually, I recently just dug up some of my high school films. I still have them somehow. 480i, I think, is the resolution. But anyway, I didn't know what resolution was at that time. So the 5D came later. Basically, when I just started film school, I had a Rebel T2i, a Canon. that had 1080p video. And so this was like the very early days of that. In film school, it was great. We were actually the last year at NYU Tisch to shoot our sophomore year films on 16 millimeter. And not just shoot, but edit. So we shot on black and white reversal on the RES camera in regular 16, not Super 16, and then edited the film on flatbeds, which was really, really cool. And we were the last year to do that. So that was, I think, a really lucky and special circumstance. And other than that, yeah, a lot of student projects were kind of, you could use the school's camera, but which at that time they didn't really have a ton of digital cameras. They still had the Super 16 cameras, and they had like HVX cameras, which were kind of obsolete at that point. And then, of course, like the year after us got, Sony FS7 or whatever it was at the time. So we were kind of stuck in the middle. But at that point, it's like a few people had a 5D, like some classmates. So you would be like, hey, can I borrow your 5D for this student film and that. That said, one of the great things about NYU Tisch is that to not put too fine a point on it, you end up going to school with a lot of rich kids. And so a lot of the directors, when they get to senior year, some people spend like a kind of stupid amount of money on their student films and would want to rent, like go out to a rental house and rent a better camera. So I did a few student films on the Alexa, like the OG Alexa at the time. And Airy Rental, which at the time was called Airy CSC in New Jersey, for anyone listening who might remember the good old days. Yeah, I thought you might. They had a great deal where so they had a camera that was called the D21. This was the Alexa prototype, basically, that dates back to like 2007 or something like that. Anyway, these things were dinosaurs, and they were just sitting around there. 1080p camera, like full 15-stop dynamic range, Alexa sensor, it was all the bells and whistles, but it was like a 1-ton weight. I mean, it was gigantic.
It was like a fully equipped Panavision
Yes.
Panaflex
Yes.
camera, but it was a video
and you
camera.
couldn't record internally, so it had SDI out, and you had to record to an external drive. Now, when it was designed, you would record to HD cam tape, but by the time we were shooting with them in like 2012, 13, they had codex recorders and all these other external recorders like Odyssey Q something, I can't remember. But anyway, you could basically take the SDI signal and plug it in. I mean, now you have the Atomos Ninja, but at the time that didn't exist. So they would rent that camera out for $500 a weekend with ultra primes and like the shittiest accessories that they had available. But still, you're working with like, an O'Connor head, a Manfrotto tripod, and an Airy matte box, and all the high-end stuff. So some of these student films like had pretty decent production value because of those elements. Now, we were still students, so nobody knows what they're doing. But in terms of access to gear and quality, I think we were really lucky to be able to have some tools that we had access to really early. And some of these student films we were able to do some really crazy stuff. I mean, all of this had to be heavily approved by the school. Like, you had to go through a pretty rigorous process of approval, but they had really robust safety training after some accidents that happened before my time. So everything was really above board. But I mean, I did a student film where we rented a helium balloon light and floated it up over a field, and we shot on Alexa. We had a crane. We had like all these kind of pretty high-end tools that we didn't know what to do with. But you read about it in American Cinematographer, or you see some behind the scenes, or you go work on somebody else's set and see them using professional tools. And you're like, oh, I know what to do with that. It's a balloon light. You light it up, you shoot it up in the air, and there you go. So anyway, all that to say, I think there were some really lucky early opportunities to play around with like some pretty professional level equipment, which I think was really cool. And NYU Tisch also has a really good alumni network, at least in New York. So there's a lot of if you play your cards right, if you do it the right way, which is like as soon as you land freshman year, first week, find the seniors and be like, hey, I want to crew on your films. Then you pretty quickly develop some relationships that as they graduate and start working professionally, they bring you on to, their initial professional shoots as a camera assistant or second AC or a PA or whatever. So I definitely took advantage of that a lot too, and had some really fortunate early opportunities to like see what a professional film set was like while still in school. So yeah, that was pretty cool.
That's incredible. I mean, you mentioned HVX, and I get flashbacks. Like we were putting was it the lettuce adapter?
Yep.
With like the spinning glass with a old Nikon 35 mil lenses on it to try to get some semblance of like shallow depth of field.
Because this was the thing that I have this core memory from high school, where for the first time up until high school, I'd been filming silly little movies with my friends on like literally my dad's camcorder. So this was the lowest quality. I mean, prosumer doesn't even, that's too generous. This is a consumer level handy cam for home videos. So when we got to high school and we had access to the mini DV camera, I thought like, oh, this is it. Now my stuff will look like movies, because I didn't know why it didn't look like movies, like why camcorders didn't look like films. And I had no idea at the time that it was a matter of the chip size versus the circle of confusion on the fixed lens and how it projects an image onto the chip. And that is all factored into the depth of field. I just didn't understand, why do movies look like that and have shallow depth of field and cinematic like optics, and my stuff is all in focus and is fuzzy and it doesn't match that quality. So even once I got to mini DV, which is like a 3 CCD chip sensor, it's still like a really small chip, and it's a fixed lens and all this stuff. I was like, oh no, it still doesn't look like movies. Why? Like, why doesn't it look like movies? And then you find all these little tricks, sometimes by accident, where you're like, oh, you know what? Well, if I zoom in all the way on the lens and put someone in the foreground and then put somebody else separated from them, there's shallow depth of field. They're the one in the background's out of focus, the one in the foreground's in focus. Look, miracle. And then of course when DSLRs came in, then it was like, oh, okay, suddenly this looks like movies, at least in terms of depth of field. Then you start to get into, I mean, those old sensors were hideous with their shutter refresh rate. So anytime you move them, it looked terrible. Obviously the dynamic range was awful. Like highlights would look terrible, and you weren't shooting in log or anything like that. So I remember also at the time there were all these hacks. Like Abel Cine had all these guides on the website of like, all right, here's how to hack the 5D, like, and
Magic Lantern,
exactly.
Man.
And here's the settings. Set your shadow levels to -4. Set your green levels to 2. Set your this, and go in one by one and adjust the little setting. So yeah, I definitely remember those times. We had the lettuce adapters as well for the Sony cameras that the school had, so you could put a lens on it and actually have it look like a movie. So yeah, I have a lot of nostalgia for those days, even though nowadays nobody would know what we're talking about. I mean, anybody who came up in the last 10 years is like, what's wrong with you? but that's part of the process. I mean, I think those early days of digital were interesting. Like I think we're kind of still there a little bit. Like, I don't know if we've fully mined everything that there is in terms of, what you can do with digital cameras yet. And I mean, we're mostly there. The technology has never been better, but there's still more interesting places to go. I mean, even just, you mentioned the creator, like shooting at 12,800 ISO. That's not something I'd really done before. And it kind of unlocks a whole new perspective on lighting and how much you see in a frame and curation. So anyway, all that to say is I think we're still on that journey with experimenting with digital formats and seeing what they can do. And this isn't to kind of, get into the film versus digital comparison, but I think it's just interesting. It's just an interesting. I think all of us probably came up, and well, everybody working now above a certain age has had to deal with that transition and deal with the emergence of digital technology. So, I think we're all kind of still in the experimental phase, which is cool.
I think that the camera and the lenses don't make the cinematic look. You do the cinematic look, the way you light, the way you frame. I mean, I bet you anything that if you go back now, I give you a Super 8,
Yeah,
uh, like that, like the oldest video camera possible, and a VHS camera even. And I tell you to shoot a scene, that scene will look much more like what you do now, cinematically speaking, because you know how to put the light, you know how to create depth with light,
yes,
and shadows, not only with with the shutter and the iris. So I think I truly believe that it's not on the machine, it's not film versus digital, or 8K versus 2K. It's how you storytell, how you tell the story, how you light, and how you frame, and that's what makes the things truly cinematic. I know I was in the same place. I mean, I started shooting in video
yeah,
8 too, and I was like, oh, I was just doing like crazy grades, like super highlights and super crunch and black, just to make it look deep, just out of the
yeah,
video.
yeah,
But as the time goes by, at least I feel like it's not on the machine. It doesn't freaking matter. I mean, the creator will look as it looks, even if you had shot the movie in 16 millimeter 500
yeah.
stock. It will look gorgeous because you light it
Yeah,
gorgeous.
yeah, yeah. No,
And
you're completely right, and I think that took me a while as a cinematographer to realize that it's. I mean, I was about to say cinematography is all lighting. It's not all lighting, but I think it's like 95% lighting. There is still, you have to
Yeah.
leave a little room for lensing. I mean, I think lenses, especially nowadays, really do influence it because there's so many options, and we're not living in a world anymore where it's like the only question we're asking lens wise is a binary: is it anamorphic or spherical? Now it's like, okay, but what kind of anamorphic? Is it clean anamorphic? Is it vintage anamorphic? Is it kind of messy anamorphic with a lot of character and aberrations? Is it more structured? Is spherical? Is it clean and sharp? Is it blurry on the edges and astigmatic and quote unquote vintage as well, right? So I think there is some authorship there, and obviously in terms of focal length, there's definitely authorship, but it really is mostly lighting, and I think that's probably the thing that was least touched on, like in certainly when I was learning in high school, but even in film school, like it's I mean, the lighting concepts that we were taught in a classroom setting were very irrelevant, I think, to like how I light
Hmm.
now. But I guess you need to. It's like learning a musical instrument. It's like you need your rudiments down before you can advance to the next level. Yeah.
before you turn the overdrive on and go like, fuck it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like
Let's
if you're
go.
learning how to drum, it's like you need to know your rudiments before you can start playing the kit. So in hindsight, it makes sense, but it's like a lot of hard light. Like the funniest thing looking back on the high school films or even student films that I did is the unrefinement of the lighting, and not knowing really how to harness light, how to shape it, how to make it feel naturalistic but still curated and stylized. It's a lot of, especially in the high school films, it's like, well, we only had two hard light. I didn't even know what they were, but we had two hard lights, two hard spotlights. So all of the lighting is just like hard light here, shadow on the wall. Like it's very messy. It's very lit, but at least I was experimenting with it already. Like there's some stuff I look back on, I'm like, oh, kind of accidentally stumbled on something really fundamental there that I didn't realize I was doing at the time. But yeah, honing that and understanding how light works and how it how it works in the real world, how natural light works, how the sun works on an interior, on an exterior, how light looks when it's bounced, how light looks when it's reflected, how light looks when it's cascading between multiple buildings, how the color temperature of the objects that the light is bouncing off of affect it, how the sky affects it, how different practicals and color temperatures and all these things. That like came with years and years of not even focused study, just observation. Like now I can't help walk around and see it everywhere. Like you just suddenly, even just the other day, I was like on a hike and walking through a forest, and the light was coming in and kind of bouncing off the ground, and you're like, oh, this spot right here, like the way the light bounces off of the ground right in this spot, and then the shadow that this tree is creating, like this natural negative fill, it's creating this perfect little lighting ratio, like right in this little spot. It's like perfect. Just take a picture of it, and I can recreate that. I know how to recreate that now. But that's the thing that took the longest to kind of really figure out. Like that's what cinematography is really about. So I couldn't agree more with with your statement.
It's funny. I got my phone full of that kind of
Yeah,
pictures
right.
of. Oh, I love that little corner over there.
Yeah.
I love how the street light is creating this shadow on that, and I think that I got hundreds of those pictures that I rarely go back
Yeah.
to, but I got them, and sometimes I remember. Oh, I took that picture of the red light creating this shadow somewhere, and I go and
Yeah,
find it.
exactly.
It's
Yeah, it's in deep storage
Yeah,
for
and
later
sometimes I
use.
think the
yeah.
act of taking the
Yeah.
picture is making a conscientious choice to remember it, right? Like even if you don't necessarily go and look at the actual photo again. I mean, even just with this example, like that image has stayed in my mind for a week. And I did take a picture of it, and I haven't looked at it since, uh, but
It's like taking a note while writing a book,
exactly, it
though.
helps
Like
you,
reading a
right?
book.
It
Yeah.
helps you, like reiterate the concept, even if you don't go back and reread your notes. So yeah.
Nice. Did you have any, I mean, going back to just really briefly to those
Yeah.
student films and then maybe the way you do things now, was there any semblance of like a prep for these things? Or did you just kind of like, here's the script and you start on day one versus like how you do it now and how we
Oh,
do it
no,
now?
we would always prep those. I think, I don't know where that concept came from. I mean, they must have taught us prep. Like they must have said, okay, well, when you do a project, here's, yeah, they did because you know what it was is they were really smart. I'm like remembering this now. Everything pre-COVID is like a brain fog, so I have to like really dig into the recesses.
Yeah.
Anything before March 2020, and this was over 10 years ago at this point. So, but yeah, like when you took a production class at Tisch, there was a whole process that you would go through throughout the semester before you even shot the film. And each week you would come in and be like, all right, let's so next week you're going to bring in your shot lists. So that's your homework for the week, is you got to go home and shot list the film. so we would shot list.
So you're doing like an ultra extended
It's
prep
actually an extended
then.
prep,
It's
yes.
like the whole
And
okay.
on the thesis films, you had to submit a whole production packet. So like you had to scout and take photographs of every location. You had to do overhead diagrams. You had to submit kind of like a bit of an onerous amount of information because they had to kind of safety approve everything. So like anytime you were shooting next to water or like anything that was not just two people sitting in a living room, the just to emphasize how somewhat over the top this was, there was a scene I remember in one of the films that I was the first AC on. I didn't shoot it, but I was just the first AC. And there's a scene in the script. It's all set at a house. You'd think this would be the most innocuous script ever. It's like two kids at a house. But there's a scene where they were playing in a pile of dead leaves. And they flagged that as a safety hazard. They were like, you need to have a safety person on set and a doctor because the kids are playing in the leaves and one of them could have their eye poked out. And you're like, okay. I mean, sure, fair. But also, like, it's not a stunt. There's just kids playing in the leaves. Kids play in the leaves all the time. So that was the level of detail that you had to provide. So as a result, yeah, we would do pretty heavy prep on everything. Everything was fully shot listed, um, often storyboarded, and every location scouted, photographed. Blocking was planned out. So yeah, I think it was it's probably more thorough prep than I do on some projects now. So, not so much narrative projects, but maybe
That's incredible.
commercials. Sometimes you're sort of like, okay, tech scout. All right, I see the space. We'll do the shots here, 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 and here. It's all pre-boarded anyway, and here's our lighting, and that's
Yeah,
it. Or this was a lot more
that's
methodical,
cool.
I think. But yeah, I think that was a good. It instilled a good practice. That level of prep. I think I do less now. I do a little bit less, like especially in terms of shot listing and storyboarding. Like I think if I went back into my folders, I still have everything from all those films. So I'm sure if I went back and looked at those shot lists, they're like way too detailed. Whereas nowadays, I think for most scenes, unless it's something really complex, if I am shot listing, it would probably be like shot of this, shot of this, shot of this, like without much further detail. Because part of the fun, and I think also part of the process, is discovering the specifics on the day. Like if you overplan it, I mean, here's a cautionary tale, I suppose, of this, but there was a project that I did a long time ago where it's a first time director, and this isn't their fault at all, but we heavily shot listed the piece, very detailed, very specific, kind of like what I was describing. But there were multiple instances I remember that on the day we would be on set and something else would present itself, like something else would speak to you. And you'd be like, oh, you know what? This thing that we planned, that we wrote down in the shot list, this actually doesn't make sense. We should really cover the scene from here. It looks a lot better. This blocking makes more sense. It's more open to camera. There's better depth. Like let's change to this. And they just wouldn't budge. Like they didn't budge the whole shot list. They were like, no. We're shooting the shot list. We shot listed the film, and we're going to shoot the shot list. But we shot listed in a vacuum. Like that's the problem with it, is we shot listed in a room somewhere, and now we're on set. And we scouted the set, obviously, but it wasn't dressed. It wasn't art directed. That changes things. We didn't have the actor there. They didn't show us their ideas. It wasn't lit. We're just looking at an unlit location. So all of those things contribute to the final image, and not just contribute, but I think are like direct. I mean, they're kind of the core of the final image, and so it's really hard. And I mean, maybe hard isn't the right word. Like I think it's just moot to like sit in a room somewhere and over plan to the tiniest detail a hypothetical approach to something that when you don't even know all the variables, and then there's a risk of getting stuck with that idea. So I think as time goes on, I get certainly more and more comfortable just certainly shot listing in a broad sense, like broad strokes, or having a general idea, like at least thinking about a scene, but leaving a lot of room on the day for like, let's actually see what this looks like in situ and with all these additional elements, because so much of it is driven by that. And it depends on the scene. I mean, if it's a scene of people talking, I probably won't even bother shot listing that at all, because like, let's show up, like, let's get it on its feet. Let's see what the actors bring to it. Let's see what the director brings to it. Let's see if we can come up with interesting blocking. And then once we've done that, let's see if there's an interesting way to capture this that is, efficient and dynamic and embraces the space and the actors and the blocking and the characters. You can't plan that in advance. You just can't.
Yeah, I find shot listing like references. They're very useful to communicate with the director, to understand what movie he's got in his
Yeah.
head or her head, uh, and just to advance on stuff like, oh, maybe we need a crane here, or maybe he's thinking on aesthetic and whatever, all
Totally.
that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. But then, as the references, going to set, you have to take the references and the shot list, make a pile, toss it, and make the scene your own, and make the scene what's worth for the movie. Because you're right. I mean, when you're sitting here with like now, I'm on that
Yeah.
process. I'm with Joe. Shot listing, yeah. We have 75 shots in one scene, and then we on the day we show up there. It's like, you know what? This, we're done. Let's see actor play, and having that ability and having that open mind, it's super important to make movies, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
I completely agree.
Well, like Warren said, I was say
No, no.
sorry to interrupt, but that's the fun of it, man. Like that's what's enjoyable about it is getting in there with all of the people with their hands in the pot and like making it
Exactly.
happen. If you're just there focused on the end result,
Yeah.
like
Like that's the process of filmmaking. And on a commercial, it's like, I get it. On a commercial, it's not only helpful, but I think often necessary to have not just a shot list and storyboards, but an animatic. That's my favorite thing, to show up in a commercial with an animatic. I'm like, oh, this is perfect. This leaves no question marks and no variables, because anytime there's questions or variables, there's indecision and there's doubt and there's all these things that cause delays. And I'm like, on a commercial, I want to know. I want to know what they want. I want to know what the client wants, and therefore what the director wants. And like, I find it really helpful to have an animatic, because then I can even know, like, oh, this camera move needs to be 4 seconds, because you're making 30 or 60 second or however long thing. It's fixed in length. The edit is precise. Like, there's no wasted moment on something like that. And so when you start playing the game of timing on those things, it's like it's just it's a whole different skill set, I think. At least on that side. The lighting side and all that, very similar. But the shot listing side and the shot execution side, it's a lot more plug and play. But like, you can't make a movie plug and play. Like, you just can't. It would lose everything that makes it a film, which is spontaneity and believability and immersion, and all the things that you want from a narrative to experience would be lost if you treat it like, here's the assembly line of, okay, well, we need to get this shot and it needs to be 10 seconds long, and then we need to get this shot and it needs to be 2 seconds long. It's like all that is gone. So yeah, I completely agree. And the other thing that it makes me think of is, I remember reading about the screenwriter of Arrival said something. Oh, sorry, not Arrival. It was Alex Garland. It was Annihilation. Alex Garland was talking about the process of writing Annihilation. And I loved what he said about it. He said that he read the book, and then he started writing the screenplay, and he never looked at the book again. He wanted to write a script based on his memory and his impression of the book, as opposed to, highlighting certain lines and flagging pages and doing what the traditional adaptation process would look like. He was like, I don't want to make that kind of movie. I don't want to just feel like I'm creating the cookie cutter line by line adaptation of this book. I want to recapture the feeling that I felt reading the book and the emotion and the memories that I have from reading it. And I think about shot listing and reference images in the same way, where I like to, especially with reference images, like, I do a lot of that in prep, a lot of reference images. It's a great way to get on the same page as a director and understand, like, really get into minutia, which I really appreciate. Like, do you like the contrast ratio in this image? Do you like the color contrast in this image? Do you like what's a medium shot? Is this a medium? Is this a medium? And kind of really drilling into the language, like getting your language on the same page and speaking the same dialect. But once that process is kind of done, I like to go on set and then not look at the reference images ever again, because I just want to remember, like, the ones that stick, the images and concepts and specific lighting or specific ideas that came from the reference images. The ones that come up and that stick in your memory, those are the important ones. And so, and that's what ends up affecting what you do on set, as opposed to just checking back, like, oh, are we doing this exactly like that? Are we doing this exactly like that? And increasingly, I feel the same way about shot lists. I mean, occasionally it is still nice to kind of check your homework a little bit and be like, just to make sure, is there anything when we discussed this scene 2 months ago that in the fray of the moment we're missing? Like, let's just check. But generally speaking, I do like to adopt that approach too.
Yeah, Alex Garland's analogy is perfect. It's what you remember about the reference, what you remember about the starting point, it becomes your movie. It becomes your, and sometimes you go back. Have you ever done
all
that?
the time.
Just go back to your references and go like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I mean, I started here and I end up over there. How this
Yeah.
happened? But it's
Yeah.
just how that's
Yeah,
your movie.
exactly. It's so fun. Well, I like going back to the references and then being like, oh yeah, oh, I ended up stealing that shot. Oh, I ended up stealing that shot. Like subconsciously, unintentionally, you're like, oh yeah, we really
Yeah.
stole a lot from that, and oh yeah, and just seeing how much it seeps into the subconscious process of making the movie. But I love that. I think that's really cool. I really appreciate that part of the process, and sometimes it's tough. I mean, I'm generally like a pretty uh, type A, very organized kind of person in my personal life, and I like to plan and I like to know things, and having to or learning to embrace to abandon a lot of those concepts while filming um, was a really interesting process, but I think a really necessary one. Not just while filming, by the way, also while navigating the career, where you also need to abandon a lot of concepts of planning and knowing what's going to happen next and anticipating things, because things happen fast and they come out of nowhere, and you have to be ready to
Mhm.
pivot and at a moment's notice and embrace opportunities and be nimble, and it's all the things that you have to do on set. It's like you also have to do offset. But yeah.
Yeah. That's fun. Yeah, you miss like in the moment brought up Arrival. In my mind, with some of the concepts you're talking about, immediately went to some of the things I've heard like Bradford Young talk about. Like it's like jazz. You get all the elements, all the right players in the room, and as long as the situation's appropriately been prepped, like now let's have fun and figure out what comes up in the
Yeah.
moment. And I've always kind of
Yeah,
resonated with
totally.
that.
Now, I will also add the caveat that that gets harder to do the less budget you have. Like, it's very easy to say that on I don't know the budget. Excuse me. I don't know what the budget of Arrival was. Let's say $50 million.
Yeah.
So $50 million and 50 shoot days or whatever. It's easier to do that at that
Mhm.
scale than it is when you have, $800,000 and 20 shoot days. Uh,
Yeah.
so, which I've done multiple films around that, certainly at that, on that schedule, 18, 19, 20 days. So those ones sometimes require a slightly higher level of planning, only because
Mhm.
you wouldn't be able to get through the script otherwise. Like there just isn't enough time to play. But I do still think that even in those circumstances, with good filmmakers and smart decisions, um, you can still kind of create the fertile ground for that kind of creativity, at least in most cases. And you do need to get a little bit more specific. I mean, on a film at that level, like anything under 4 million, you really have to plan your specialty equipment days. Like, when do we have a steady cam? When do we have, let's say we're going to
Mhm.
have a jib for one day or a crane for one day. What's the day we're going to have that? Or, um, uh, a cherry picker and bigger HMIs and a tow Jenny. Like,
Mhm.
what are the days we're day playing that stuff? Because that's not the kind of stuff you're just carrying around with you and playing jazz with. Like, you really have to be
Mm-mm.
deliberate and precise about that stuff. But that's also the case at higher budgets that I've experienced too. So I guess it's doesn't really change much. Uh, but
Mhm.
there is a little bit more room for that kind of creativity when you have the budgetary cushion and the crew and the time. So it's all a balance, and I think I certainly don't. I wouldn't hold it against anyone who wants, especially on a lower budget project, to be like, let's just plan the shit out of this, like out to every tiny minute detail. And I have done that. I've done
Mhm.
films that way, and I think it probably was the right approach. Like, I did do a film that was around that budget range. It was 4.5, but we had 19 shoot days, and it was quite complex. It was very elevated, stylized film, stylized visual language, all set builds and kind of complex sequences. Like, this was not a domestic drama with people sitting around in rooms talking, and I've done those films too. But this one was definitely required a higher level of execution that also required a higher level of planning. Um, but so I think it was appropriate for that one considering the circumstances. The ideal version of that kind of film is we have 30 days and double the budget, and then we would have had a little bit more breathing room. But it is what it is. There's also the realities of the the industry, so that we have to contend with, especially nowadays. But yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking earlier about difference between prepping a movie or prepping a music video or a commercial. But one of the things that I admire most about your reel, and I admire a lot about your reel,
Thank you.
is that the consistency that you have. I mean, you can take scenes from music videos, scenes from the commercials, and scenes from the movies you make, uh, interchange them, and I won't be able to say which one is what, because your look is so cinematic. Whatever you shoot, it's so uh, narrative looking
Mhm.
always that is it's spectacular for me.
Oh, thank you.
So, uh, how much is that kind of style something that you pursued all your career? Is something that you find out that you were good at? How did you end up with these gorgeous looking pictures?
It's so funny. I love this question because I also love hearing how other people talk about it, and I always think about whenever Roger Deakins is asked about style, and he says, "Oh, I don't have a style. Um, cinematographers shouldn't have a style, and I don't have one. And I do comedies and dramas and westerns and sci-fi and this and that." And then it's like, okay, yeah, it's very easy to say that, but if you actually look at the work, it's like, of course you have. He has a very consistent set of aesthetic
Yes.
sensibilities, lensing preferences, lighting techniques, and approaches that transcend genre and transcend all these different films. And so it comes down to semantics. Like, is that style? I think.
Yeah, or it's a tendency, it's a style,
Well,
whatever. But
exactly,
I think we all
we
have
do.
that. We lean towards
And I think that
something.
that's what it gets to, is that I think that the reason that Roger denies that he has a style is because I think the implication of the word is that it's intentional, is that it's something that he's like, well, if I'm on a project, I this is how I'm going to do. I'm going to impose um, this look because I have a style and I need to stick to my style, right? That's not what happens, and that's not what happens with me either. What happens is I have a taste, and I have like certain sensibilities and aesthetic uh, characteristics that I gravitate towards, and I like to see, and they create that pleasing sense of wholeness and completion and satisfaction when I look at them, which is just the brain chemical reaction to experiencing an aesthetically pleasing experience. And whether I want to or not, when I'm on set, I work my way backwards to creating images that do that for me. And so whatever the project, that's kind of what ends up happening. And I think that's probably what ends up happening with Roger too, is like you just have a very honed sense of aesthetic pleasure and satisfaction.
Mm.
And so anything that you do that goes through your eye and your brain and that interpretive process is going to end up looking a certain way by nature of that honed sense of aesthetic. And
Mm.
I'm still kind of early in my career, so I think I'm still honing that aesthetic, and still it can evolve and change over time and enhance and morph and shift. Uh, but I do think that I know what I like, and I know it when I see it. And as time goes on, you learn how to create it and learn how to kind of work your way backwards to, oh, well, I know that when I do lighting this way or place a light in this manner, it will create something that I like. So then I sort of start gravitating towards making those decisions. And then that's how that look emerges, right? It's the opposite of doing it intentionally. It's like doing it unintentionally, but you work your way backwards to intentionality, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. But
Hmm.
yeah.
Totally. Something Juanmi and I talk about, they get brought up a lot, and he'll probably say that I like things a certain way, and I'll say he likes things a certain way, is
Yeah,
lensing, anamorphic versus spherical. And I know Juanmi, maybe he can speak to it a little bit, thinking about how things, you've done things in the past and the evolution of the style and aesthetic. I think he'll say for sure that his style or whatever, his tastes have changed over the
sure.
years. Whereas I'm still in this very grungy, like I like dirty anamorphics and, things like that, shallow depth of field. Where do you see yourself, right? Do you see yourself changing? Where do you see yourself now? Like with
Yeah,
lenses?
great question. I think lenses is probably the arena where I am most nimble, because I kind of just fall in love with different aesthetics when I bump into them. And then, you kind of have like a little era. So it's like, oh, I have my dirty anamorphic era. Like, I'm just really into that.
Yeah.
And then you do that for a while, and then you're like, ugh, this looks so nothing's in focus, and it's too grungy, and it's like, what looks really good is like a nice, crisp, clean, spherical lens. And then you start
Yeah.
shooting on those again, and then you're like, oh man, what have I been doing? Why haven't I been shooting on these crispy spherical lenses? And then you shoot on those for a while, and then you're like, ugh, I'm bored. What's interesting out there? Oh God, look, there's all these vintage stills lenses, and they're super interesting. The stills lenses are like, they're sharp, but they tend to fall off a lot on the edges, and they create all this really interesting patina, especially around the sides and the edges, and vignetting and blur and astigmatism. And you're like, oh, that's really cool. That's really interesting. And some of them are super shallow and super fast and really great close focus. And then you start putting lenses right in people's faces and having the background fall off and all this stuff, and falling in love with that look. And then you do a few spherical projects in a row, and then you're like, oh man, you know what I really miss? Anamorphic. And so I definitely find myself doing that. And as a result, I think I really enjoy being nimble with lensing, and being intentional about shooting different projects on different lenses. And when it's a narrative project, really putting in the time to test out different lenses and different looks, and seeing like not just what am I into, but what feels right for this project. On commercials, I don't need to really determine that. It's more personal, because nobody really cares. So it's a more personal preference. But there's where I try to be deliberate about shooting different commercials on different lens sets. Like every commercial that I do, I'm like, all right, what's a lens set that I haven't tried yet? There's some new lens set. Let me try it. Or I remember reading about that or seeing some images from that. I want to take it out for a spin, or whatever it is. And that way it keeps it fresh. So it's like, if I do one on a set of vintage rehoused stills lenses, then the next one I do, I'll try, the latest sharp Leica lens that just came out. And same with the anamorphic, and so on. I mean, obviously there's some limitations, like, and especially in commercials, like there has to be an appetite for anamorphic from the client side and the agency side. But other than that, generally speaking, I feel like you can get away with a lot. So I just try to keep it fresh. I think that's really the answer, is like, in order to avoid feeling bored or feeling, that kind of ebb and flow, I'm like, I just want to keep it interesting at all times, and try different things and try new things. And I'm always testing new lenses. I love to, anytime Old Fast Glass announces like, oh, we have a new rehousing project, or we just got these lenses in, or Kesslo or Camtech or any of the places, I call them up right away, and I'm like, hey, when can I come in? I want to come see them. I just want to get my eyes on them, and just know what's out there, and know what's available. And the honest truth is, like, a lot of lenses look really good, and really interesting, that cover the whole gamut that I just said: anamorphic, spherical, vintage, modern, clean, dirty. Like, they all look good, and they all look interesting. And so it's like, you can't really go wrong. And so it just becomes a question of like, what do I prefer? What do I want to try? What do I prefer now?
in my follow-up, like I'm going to press you on
Oh
this
yeah.
for a second, is like your desert island, you can only shoot on one lens set for the rest of your life, every
Yeah,
single
that's
project.
easy actually. I have a very easy answer for that. And I could even narrow it down to one focal length. 35 millimeter Zeiss super speed. Done. Yeah, shoot on that for the rest of the,
Nice, because you can stop it down and get cleaner. You can open it all the way up and have a certain
yeah.
look. You got kind of two lenses
Those
in
lenses
one
are
there.
also pretty sharp wide open. People think of them as vintage glass, but they're really sharp. And they're fast, small, great close focus, have a look, have a characteristic, but they're not completely fuzzy and fall apart. 35 millimeters is the perfect focal length on spherical. Well, depending on your sensor size, but let's say generic approach. I mean, it kind of works for a larger format because it's just a little wider. It also works for Super 35. It's just a little tighter, but it still works. So yeah, 35 millimeters Zeiss super speed. That's the desert island lens. So
Solid.
you know, throw all the rest of them out. Let me just shoot on that one lens for the rest.
Every project
exactly.
from here on out.
Mine will be 29 millimeters Sumilux.
Interesting. Okay, I like it. I like that.
Basically, for the same reasons you choose the 35 super speeds. It's perfect for close-ups, for wide shots, amazing bokeh and focus drop. I think it's the perfect lens for me.
Yeah. What's yours? Now we got to put you on the spot.
Me on the spot. I mean,
It'll be some crazy funky anamorphic.
Yeah. You can't.
No, if you really pressed me on it, I wouldn't say a specific focal length, but I'd say the K35.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a great choice. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I would just say that.
It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, and I wouldn't go anamorphic because I don't shoot everything on anamorphic like Juanmi seems to think I do. But those have enough character and enough grunge for me that I could get, you know, for cropping it and going for a widescreen aesthetic. I think I could get enough out of it that it would please me. And
couldn't agree more. That's definitely a go-to. That's one that I go back to quite a bit. K35s. It's just such a great look. And you know what I love about K35s, among many things, but one of the most underrated things about it that people don't, I think, focus on enough, the flares. I love how those lenses flare. Like, they're really beautiful, complex, consistent. I just love it. Even with a lot of other spherical lenses, especially certain vintage ones, whether it's cinema or stills, there could be a lot of inconsistency with the flaring. And a lens that could look gorgeous on as a portrait lens, like the minute you put a point source on it, it just looks like shit. But K35s, they're just the whole package. Like, I love how they look on portraits. I love how they render depth and backgrounds, but I also love how they flare. Like, they're just kind of perfect. So yeah.
Speaking of flares and anamorphic, where you usually kind of tie the two. I just did a commercial yesterday, and we shot on Cook anamorphics, like the OGs. You can not get those things to flare, dude. Like, they're so clean. You have to shoot them wide open.
I hate those lenses. I have to admit, I hated them when they came out, and I still hate them, and I hate when I see them, sadly. Yeah. And a lot of people use them because they're very ubiquitous and very accessible, and they're really nicely built. But in addition to the flares, I also I hate the inward pin cushion. Yeah. It drives me nuts. And look, this is what's so wonderful about cinematography and about filmmaking in general and art, is it's subjective and everybody has different taste. The show The Boys shoots on Cook anamorphic, and they don't have any of those issues. I think they maybe are enhancing the flares with CG, or maybe they're using the soft flares or something that have better flaring. They don't shoot wide focal length, so you're not getting the pin cushion. They're always on tighter lenses. And that show looks gorgeous. So some people are finding their way around the aesthetics, and some people just don't mind the pin cushion, and that's fine. That's okay. But it's one of those little things that drives me nuts. And there's stuff that I probably don't care about that other people would be like, I don't know how you can stand that. Like, you know what, on the K35s? The K35s have this thing where you can see the coatings in the bokeh a lot of times. Like, if you really have like a big piece of bokeh in the background, it's not smooth. Like, you see the texture of the glass, and some people would hate, like, some people just clomb on that and are like, I just don't like that. I don't mind it. I just don't even really notice it. So it just goes to show that everybody has their preferences and their like little idiosyncrasies that they like or don't like. But man, quick anamorphics, yeah, that's a tough one.
The biggest thing, like beyond even the look too, is it just slowed us down. Like it was a smaller budget commercial and we didn't have a second. And it's like just to get the
Oh
day,
yeah.
you're like, okay, go from the 40 to the 65 macro, which
Oh,
is
they're
like
big. They're big.
bazooka.
Yeah. Those are chunky lenses.
And it's all easy rig handheld, and you're like, we're just not gonna get the number of shots.
That 65 macro is nice though. I will say that is a nice focal length. I also do try to, I don't know about you guys, I'm curious to hear, but I tend to gravitate towards like 2 focal lengths on a project. And yeah, right. So that tends to simplify. The Creator was 1 focal length, which was really cool.
Yeah.
And I would do that again on a narrative, at least like, not even as an exercise. It's not an ideology. It's just it just creates such a visual consistency that that lends itself to the visual language. Like it feels so cohesive. And if you can, I mean, if you're able to put yourself in a situation where, well, if I need a wide shot, I just step back, and if I need a close up, I just come closer, then you're kind of gravy. Like to me, it really is the most pure form of cinematic expression. Like and I love simplicity in everything, in lighting, in lensing, in cameras, and all of it. I love simplifying all of the processes. I don't like getting fancy with filters or tricks or stuff like that, or multiple different lens sets and different focal lengths from this and that and so on. It's like I just love the simplicity of 1 camera system, 1 focal length, 1 a simple lighting approach that's very source, singular source and all that. And so that really dovetails into that approach. Like just the 1 focal length it's simple from a logistics standpoint, and it's simple from a visual standpoint, and it creates this really great consistency.
What was that lens that you guys used on the Creator?
It was a 75 millimeter Kowa anamorphic. And now I can't let go of that notion. Like shooting anamorphic on a large format sensor, the first thing I put on is whatever's in that range, 70 mil, 80 mil, like whatever's in that kind of ballpark. I'm like, that's the first thing I want to see, because to me, that's kind of the ideal focal length for that format. Anamorphic, 2 times anamorphic on a larger format sensor. And, it might be a little different on Super 35, certainly would be different on a medium format, different with different squeeze factors. But for that film, that focal length was perfect. 50 was too wide, 100 was too tight. It's like, it was right in the sweet spot.
Were those, do you remember? Come on. Was it the OG Kawas, like the
Yes.
originals, or was it the PS Technic
Well,
rebuilds?
they were rehoused, but it was not the Evolution, which is the PS Technic kind of redo of the lenses. So it was the OG rehoused Kowas, which I really
nice.
Like the 75. The wider ones have their own little idiosyncrasy that I can't stand, which is the compression on the sides is nuts. So if you're in a static frame with a center punched subject, they look great. And the minute you put someone on the edge of frame, they just look insane. And the minute
that 40 mil is unusable. Like unusable
and,
in my opinion.
And unusable unless you're doing like a very specific thing with it. Like pushing in straight forward on a center punched subject, then it's great. But you can't really pan them, because when you pan, it's like you see the distortion shift across the thing. Anyway, but 40 mils too wide angle for me anyway on anamorphic. It's my personal. I also tend to gravitate towards kind of tighter, like more medium or even slightly telephoto lenses. So that's also just a personal aesthetic preference.
I heard that you guys shot the Creator at 12,800 ASA mostly. What are the problems and the advantages of shooting at that high ISO?
Yeah. Well, I think the advantages are pretty straightforward, which is that um, it allows you to do a lot more with a lot less in terms of lighting. So, for example, um, we had big night exteriors on the Creator, the kind that you would typically light up with, or traditionally, I should say, light up with, an array of Dinos and soft suns and big units surrounding an area that you're just blasting with light. But at 12,800 ISO, we were able to do that and basically achieve the same kind of exposure levels with aperture 1200Ds in cherry pickers, quarter mile away from set. And even then, we would dim them down, like they were too bright for 12,800. So, and they're run off of a little hand generator. You don't need a big tow plant. You don't need cam lock cable. You don't need big units. It's like it allows you to do a lot with much smaller units when you're starting from zero, right? Like when you're in a completely dark, empty field or a studio, like you can here was another place where it was really advantageous for us in certain interiors. We wanted to have hard shafts of sunlight coming in, which is something that I find tricky. Like I'm still kind of experimenting and figuring out like what is really the perfect way to do it, because a lot of the typical approaches are with HMIs or anything like that, they still don't quite look to me the way that the sun looks when it's coming in through a window. Like that level of parallel beam and harshness just isn't quite there when you
It's the distance too.
exactly. It's the distance and it's about the angle, right? So there are tools that can accomplish it, like mole beams. You can do it with a mole beam, but mole beams are very power hungry and very expensive. So if you're like shooting out on a location somewhere in the middle of Thailand, for example, good luck getting one. But what 12,800 allowed us to do was we managed to create those sunbeams with aperture lights again, with spotlight adapters. So the minute you put the spotlight adapter on it, you're getting your parallel beam. It's an ellipsoidal. It's like using a source 4 or anything like that. But typically the issue would be brightness, is that those units just aren't bright enough. Like anything with an ellipsoidal just isn't bright enough unless, again, you're going for like a xenon or something that isn't feasible for a location shoot. But but with 12,800 ISO, suddenly that 1200 watt light with the spotlight adapter looks really punchy and bright. Like the exposure levels on it are just way higher than they normally would be at 800 ISO. So we're suddenly able to put those through windows, and now you're like, it looks like sunlight. It finally has that look that I'm always after, and I can achieve it with a low wattage light and a very simple, spotlight adapter ellipsoidal tool without much of a fuss. So that was another advantage. The third thing the second thing that it does, which again is a little obvious, but I'll say it anyways, it allows you to see stuff that, at a lower ISO you just wouldn't really get. So another example is there's a whole sequence in the Creator on in Drew's apartment. So it's an apartment that is, it's like a penthouse that has these big floor to ceiling windows that overlook the cityscape. And we really wanted to really feel and see the city outside the windows and have that really be like a source of light that's kind of coming in from the windows. And this was shot on location on the 40th floor of a hotel in Bangkok. So you have the real city outside. And at 12,800 ISO, we were able to get up there and crank the exposure up. And suddenly the city that's outside that at a lower ISO was there, but like a little dim, is suddenly very bright and quite prominent in frame. And really managed to get that look that we were after, which was like, we want the outside to be the brightest part of the image. So that's another example of like, that's just something that ISO unlocks, that it allows you to see and get exposure even higher than the level of your own eye in that space. And I remember that Some of our execs were on set that week, and they walked onto that set, and they were really shocked. I mean, it was quite dark, like darker than even usual, like darker than even a moody film set, because there wasn't really any film lighting. Also because there were these floor to ceiling windows, so like any light we put up was just going to get reflected. So they walk on set and there's no lights and it's like pitch dark, and they're like, what are they doing? and then we were like, it's okay, here, come look at the monitor, let's look at how it looks like on monitor. And then they see it and they're like, oh, got it, looks great.
Oh my, we thought you lost your mind.
Yeah, exactly. We are a little crazy, but we're not that crazy. not yet. And this was like week one of filming too, so there's a little bit of extra, scrutiny. So it was all good. Now, here are the pitfalls. It's not a pitfall, it's just, this is the thing that becomes the biggest challenge. You have to do a lot more to take light away that you normally wouldn't have. And it becomes an equal amount, if not more, even more so than usual with digital. I feel like with digital in general, it's pretty much 50-50 adding light versus subtractive light. But at that high ISO, it maybe becomes 60-40. And a lot of it becomes about controlling light. Like if you're out on the street, for example, or even outside of the city, there's suddenly some bounce or some reflective light that's creating a fill that you wouldn't see at 800 ISO. But once you're 4 stops above that, suddenly that's there. And so you have to do a little bit more work to control it and shape it. And you also have to be really careful when adding light, because it can go from the perfect contrast ratio to like way too bright very easily and quickly. And so we had to do things that I normally wouldn't really think about, like gelling flashlights and car headlights, like stacking NDs and ND gels on car headlights and flashlights, because they are just, when we're exposing everything at such a low level, and suddenly introducing a really bright practical, it's like way brighter than you think. And normally when you look at it, you're like, oh, whatever. I mean, it's like you have your ambient level and then your flashlight, like it's going to be fine. And then you test it and suddenly you realize, oh, you know what, the flashlight is just way brighter than I thought it would be. So it requires a little bit more extra testing and extra care in reining in brighter sources and units, and then also using negative fill or subtractive lighting to take away stuff that you wouldn't even see by eye sometimes, like that oh, you know what, there actually is a little bounce and a little fill on the face, and when I look at it I don't really see it, but when you crank up the ISO it's there. So bring in the neg fill that I didn't think I needed. So that's the pitfall, quote unquote, but not really. It's just something that requires a little extra care.
I'm just imagining, like in close-ups and stuff on that set, the operator, like, oh, hey, his skin is reflecting onto the actor, and like, hey, now you're draped in doobie, buddy.
Yeah,
sorry.
Exactly. It's little things like that, but you address them as they come up, and it becomes part of the challenge. But you're exactly right. I think the funny thing is, I think a lot of us have gotten used to seeing with our eye at 500 ISO. Like we're just so used to it, between whether you have been shooting on 5219 or on digital at 500 ISO or 800 ISO is pretty similar. Like we've become so used to that, like lighting to that ratio for the last 15-20 years of filmmaking, that suddenly, adding 4 stops to that it's different. And so, it just requires a little bit of a reconfiguration and trusting the monitor. And you can't really trust your eye at that ISO. That's the other thing, is you have to rely on the monitor a little bit more, because something could look good when you look at it, or it could look too dark when you look at it, but then on the monitor, it's actually perfect. So that's the trick.
Did you have to deal with excessive grain problems?
We added grain. The image was shocking. We were surprised at how clean it was at that ISO. It's definitely noisy. It has a noise floor. It's also cleaner in ProRes RAW, which is what we recorded at to an external Ninja recorder. And we wanted it to look grainier, so we added film grain on top. But we didn't degrain much. There's a shot here and there where maybe we're digging a little bit extra into the shadows and at blue hour, like we were shooting right at the edge of when you should be shooting to get an exposure, and then in the grade we had to lift it up a little bit so you get a little bit more noise, and we denoise that and then put film grain back on top of it. But yeah, mostly we were adding, not taking away, surprisingly.
I shot my last movie
Nice.
with the Venice 2 at 6400 ASA, and it was very, very, very clean.
Yeah, I tested Venice 2 at 12,800 ISO, and it's cleaner than the FX3 at 12,800. And the FX3 at 12,800 is
Wow.
already shockingly clean. And so like the Venice at that ISO is like very usable. I mean, I think people, I don't know, maybe they just assume that you shouldn't really leave the comfort of the base ISO, but also first off, it's only 2 stops over the base ISO. So that's number one. And so it's like, if you're okay shooting an Alexa at 3,200, then you should be totally comfortable shooting a Venice 2 at 12,800. But also it's like, if you just test it and look at it, it really is shockingly clean. Like you do have to, if you want a grittier look, you have to add it. Like you're not going to get that out of the camera.
I read somewhere, Oren, that you guys had kind of multiple rigs set up for different
Yeah.
purposes with the FX3s. Were you guys using multiple cameras at the same time, or was it a single camera show?
We shot 2 cameras, like I'd say maybe a quarter of the time. It was almost, it's 75% single camera. And then on certain action set pieces or that kind of sequence, it's certainly beneficial to have a second camera on it, which I would operate. So it's always like getting something extra or something additional, and it's never it's not like TV coverage where it's like you're getting your medium and your close up at the same time. It's like one camera's on the drone getting a big wide shot, and then Gareth, so I'm operating that, and then Gareth's handheld on the ground getting something completely different, like setting up. We would have like little action pieces that would be choreographed and rehearsed by the stunt team, and so they would be able to kind of cycle through them. And so every time they would cycle through it, it's like we're getting different pieces of it, and so it's just helpful to get multiple pieces. And one time for one scene, that was just a lengthy dialogue scene between John David's character and Maddie, the little girl. It was so long; it was like a 2-page dialogue scene, and it was kind of the first scene in the script where they have like a proper kind of sit down back and forth banter, and also really the only lengthy dialogue scene between the two of them in the script. We shot that cross covered just to kind of get the dynamics between the two of them, because it was kind of too much and too complex to do that single camera, like especially because, well, there were so many limitations. I mean, she was 7 years old, so she had a hard out, can't shoot past 9 p.m. And the scene's at night. So, we only have maybe about 2 hours to do it. And then also just from an acting perspective, to keep it fresh between the two of them, like it's a shame to waste the other side of the coverage when somebody's giving you gold on camera and off camera. So we cross covered it, and we did 2 sizes. So we did like cross covered mediums and then cross covered close-ups and a wide that got us in and out of the scene, and that was it. It's very simple. The scene got shortened a lot in the film, but yeah, that was the one and only time we did that.
Or in what genre that you haven't shot is in your bucket list? What is the one that you're dying to do? In my case, it will be the musicals. What's there for you?
That's number one for me too. Oh yeah, I love musicals, and they're so rare these days. But it's I also like a really specific kind of musical, so it's not enough to, there's certain ones that are a little more kind of candy corn or cotton candy, it's a better term, that I'm less interested in. It's like I want to shoot Cabaret, or All That Jazz, or Chicago, like something gritty, but still a musical. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's a tough one. Or like to me, West Side Story, the original, of course, but the Spielberg version was aesthetically like one of the most just a pitch perfect, flawless films I've ever seen, and the movie was great overall. But yeah, so that would be a dream. Um, More sci-fi, like one you
Mhm.
get a taste of it and you just want to do more, like more in space and more um on an alien planet, or just some, kind of interesting, challenging situations. Something like Lord of the Rings, just to kind of close the full circle loop on that, because that was really the big inspiration, like to pursue this professionally, or inspiration, and also the first time I really thought about it as a possible profession. And I just love that kind of high fantasy. Like Excalibur is aesthetically one of also just the most stunning, fascinating looking movies. Like I saw The Green Knight and had, like that kind of DP envy of like, oh man, something like that would just that would be such a cool project. Western, kind of the same thing. Just the aesthetics of that are so classical and big in scale and epic in scope. So yeah, like something that would be so cool. And yeah, I mean, so many, like a David Fincher-esque crime thriller, something like Seven, or I just saw Rebel Ridge on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
Just fantastic, and something like that with that level of design and precision and in the filmmaking is it's kind of reminiscent of, it's like kind of in the Sicario world aesthetically, or but obviously story wise it's very different, but like something like that with that level of kind of grunge and grit and precision, but it's like a mix of grunge but precision, like if that makes sense. Like there isn't a single handheld shot in the whole thing. It's all like very calculated moves and very designed stuff, but there's a grit to it, and the lighting and all that. Or like Hell or High Water, I thought it's kind of like that too. Love that movie. So there's a lot. I'm at the early stages, so there's still a lot to go, but a lot of stuff on the list for sure.
I guess it all comes down to shoot good scripts with the right director and the right
That's the
cast.
thing. I mean,
Yes.
it seems like such a glib answer, but and sort of an unsatisfying one, but it really does come down to that. It's like, just want to shoot good movies, and it goes back to how it all started for me, which was a love of films, like really being a cinephile, and I still am. I watch a ton of movies all the time, and I still love cinema, and I love going to the movies and seeing new films and seeing old films, which is a really big perk and great benefit of living in LA. Um, and I just love movies, and I want to make the kind of movies that I or somebody like me would watch and think are good and be inspired by. Like that's the whole goal. Yeah.
Mm,
So
totally. Do you have any aspirations for kind of series work,
I would do it.
television? Yeah.
It's
I don't know. Again, I've never done it. How does it change the dynamics of like maintaining an aesthetic? And,
yeah.
how fun that would be from a DP's
Yeah.
perspective to actually do it for like 9, 10, 12
I mean, my
episodes.
impression of it as a viewer, because I also watch a lot of TV, and my impression of it as a viewer is like every once in a while you do get something that is you're basically making a movie. I mean, visually. So like something like Mayor of Easttown or like Andor is at such a high level cinematographically and aesthetically that I would love to do something like that. The thing is, that is such an exception to the rule of TV that it's hard to aspire towards that. I mean, I certainly do. Like if I were to do that, I haven't shot any TV, but if I were to, it would be amazing if it were something like that. Within most of the rest of TV, especially nowadays, I think TV is a lighting medium. Like you could do a lot with lighting. And there's some very beautiful lighting all over TV. I mean, so many shows to mention: Shogun, Pachinko, the other Star Wars shows, Lord of the Rings, Ozark, like all these things. It's amazing, just precision, high level lighting. underrated show, Perry Mason on HBO, that got canceled after 2 seasons. Just stunning lighting, like film noir style. Oh, that's another one I would love to do. Film noir, like a modern noir. I guess that's kind of the Fincher thing, but anyway, I digress. So it's a lighting medium, but what TV isn't is a film language medium, because so much of it, with a few exceptions, is like you're kind of just shooting coverage. Like that's just the nature of TV, is you're covering a scene. It's mostly dialogue scenes, and you're mostly shooting coverage of multiple angles, because they have fixed run times. And so you're not going to get in and just like let a scene play out in one shot, or all the stuff that I love about narratives, and like finding interesting blocking and ways to kind of combine different shots into one, or like keeping, dynamic camera movements and stuff like that. There's no time for that on TV. You have to shoot 2 or 3 cameras. You're shooting 8 to 10 pages a day. So that kind of dictates the way that it's shot. And so it's not to diminish that. It's a different thing. And I think it would be fun. It would be interesting in its own way. And again, I think from a lighting standpoint, it's very interesting, but I definitely gravitate more towards movies as a visual language, for that reason. And that's definitely what I want to focus on if I can.
Oren, is there a specific way you prep the movies? Is there a method that you follow for going from script to image?
Yeah. It really depends on the movie, and it specifically depends on the director. And this is something that I found working with Gareth on The Creator, especially because, that was really a step up for me in terms of working on a movie at a sort of higher level of budget and experience level of the other people involved. Like most of the films I'd done prior to that were with first time or second time directors. And so they don't have a go-to methodology yet, because they're also still figuring out how to approach all this. So on those films, we often do a lot of the work together, and I, as the DP, especially in the later ones, end up being the person with more experience. So I'm kind of the one coming into prep being like, okay, well, here's how I would do it. Let's do references and look at films and discuss, and then go scene by scene and do a shot list and all that. But then working on The Creator really changed it, because it made me realize just how much, like, a director who has a certain level of experience and a certain methodology that they like to work with, how much that really dictates the process, and how much it's our job to support them and give them what they need, as opposed to coming in and saying, well, here's how I would do it. And that's not just in terms of making creative decisions, it's also about the approach to the film. So like Gareth did not need me to bring references, because he had 1,000 reference images that he had already been pulling for years for this project. And he had a very clear idea of how he wanted it to look in a broad strokes sense. There was also a lot of concept art that had been made that already existed. Gareth also didn't want to shot list for a specific reason. I mean, he wanted the visual language of the film to be more kind of documentary and a little bit more improvised and reactionary. So no shot list. And so my prep work on it became a lot different. It was more about how to facilitate the way that Gareth wants to make the movie, and how to find our shooting methodology and our lighting methodology that worked with how he wanted it to look and feel, than it was about coming up with the look with him, or shot listing, or doing any of these things. And on other films, I've had to do that. On some films, I've had to shot list by myself without the director, because they were uninterested in doing that and they just wanted to work with the actors. And that's also fine. Like, everybody has their own kind of methodology and their own way that they want to approach directing. And that 100% dictates my process of going from a script to screen, because it all flows through how the director sees it, whether they see it or not, because some maybe don't have a vision and they do need you to kind of help find, and that's what you're there for. That's what we're hired for, is because they see something in our approach or aesthetic that they're like, well, I kind of want to do what you've done on this or that. And so then it's like, okay, let's discuss together how to get there. but there's a few things that stay the same. I mean, I'll always do a scene by scene breakdown of the script per location, and kind of create a little bit of a document structure that I can reference, and then start building out lighting plans for each location, and fill those out as we go, like scouting images and doing test shoots. And I always create a checklist of like things I want to test, things we need to do, things we need to get, things we need to research. And I try to be a little methodical about it. Again, it kind of just goes back to my personality, but yeah, so those things will always be constant. And then of course, hiring crew and all that. But I think the bigger one, the first and initial one, is figuring out what the director wants to do and how they want to do it. And then figure out through that process, and really listening to them. I think that listening is the key part of it. Is understanding what my role is, like how I am most beneficial to them, whether it's a more hands-on approach or a less hands-on approach, or just focusing on certain aspects while the director will focus on others. I mean, for example, God wish to have the opportunity to do this, which won't happen because he's 78 years old. But Spielberg, my favorite director, he does all the camera work on his films. Like when he collaborates with his DPs, they're doing lighting, and Spielberg is working directly with the operators to plan out the shots and pick the focal lengths and create the visual language. And so like that's a perfect example of a director. And Gareth was kind of similar in that regard. So it's like the creator was a very heavy lighting job, and it was I had a lighter touch on shot visual language, like shots, focal lengths, and so on, because Gareth was kind of in the driver's seat, and I'm more there to provide support or feedback, or be someone to bounce ideas off of and just be supportive, or if maybe he does have a question about something, like riff off of that. But it was really more of a lighting heavy job. And that was cool. That was actually really fun. And it goes back to what we were saying before, we're DPing 95% lighting anyway. So I almost kind of prefer it this way, although I recognize that most directors aren't like that. So we do have to kind of step in a little bit and kind of do the visual language part too. But I think for me, in an ideal world, I do think that like it's really great to have a director who's kind of in the driver's seat with that and understands what is the movie that they're trying to make, and visually and in terms of pacing and visual language and camera movement and all that. And I'm like, let me do the lighting. let me just help create the world, and obviously help facilitate the technical details of the camera and the lenses and the formats and the DIT and the color grade, all that stuff too. But because that's the stuff I don't want the director focusing on. Like that's all the technical stuff we can take off their plate to just leave just the creative visual language part, which is how it should be, I think.
Well, the director's vision is what makes the difference. We can light a scene exactly the same in two different scenarios, and the director's approach and the director's vision is what's going to make the difference, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And production design, locations, that was huge. That really is so much of it. And costumes. I mean, it's really everything. It's like everything that you're putting in front of the camera that isn't our department directly affects our our ability to do our job and how good it looks. But you're right. It's like we could do the same thing, like the exact same lighting in one scene with a certain actor. I mean, it even goes down to casting. Like that can also make a huge difference, which is also kind of part of the directing and a really major part of the directing. So yeah, that's really well put. Like we could put the same light in the same place on the same set, but if it's the words aren't interesting, the actor is kind of just okay, and the set dressing is kind of just okay, and so on. But other than that, it's like you have the same lens, the same lighting, and everything. It's just not as good. It doesn't look as good.
Isn't it interesting when you're lighting the standing and you're like not convinced of I'm not sure what's wrong here, and then the actor comes and it's like, wow, that was it. That was it. Now it's happening.
100%. And what a fascinating phenomenon, because it's just it's the same, but you're just replacing the subject, and it really changes how it looks. It's really interesting.
Speaking of aesthetic and helping facilitate all that, you mentioned briefly, but the color grade, how integral is that to your, achieving what you like and what you seek, and how involved are you, or how involved, especially these larger projects, are you allowed to be?
Yeah. I mean, I think the color grade is everything. Like it's like leaving out that part of it would be like baking a cake and not taking it out of the oven. It's like you have to, you have to finish it. You have to take it out and let it cool and put on the frosting, or else it's not a cake. It's just some ingredients mixed together in a bowl that are cooking somewhere. And so like it's really, really crucial, and especially in the digital age. And I don't just mean with digital cameras. I mean the age of the DI. Like even shooting on film, ever since the mid 2000s, it's like you're scanning in log cineon and color grading your footage. So it's the same whatever your source material is, but it really has become, I think, a very, very instrumental and crucial part of the image pipeline, to the point where and not just the image pipeline, but a very crucial part of cinematography and of the final image, to the point where it's like, I think a lot of times I have a negative aesthetic reaction to something because of the color grading more than other decisions. Like I think sometimes I see something that I think is actually really beautifully lit, but then it's color graded in a way that doesn't like fully enhance or capture the contrast or the ratios within the lighting, or the color contrast. And then it just doesn't look quite as good as if it were graded a different way. Now, obviously that comes down to taste and personal aesthetics, as does everything. But I do find that it is a really crucial part of it. And, we do a lot of work in the grade, especially on a narrative project, to kind of finish the work on set of shaping the light and shaping the final contrast ratios of each individual image. Like at the end of the day, I mean, the reality is we just don't have the time that people used to light and shoot on set. I remember reading the original ASC article for Alien, which was described as a low budget film at the time. And you read the article, because to me, Alien is the most aesthetically perfect film ever shot. And you read the article about it, and you're like, why? How does this movie look so good? And they shot that movie for 80 days. And it's like, that was a low budget movie at the time. And they had 80 days. So we did a rough calculation. The number of shots in the movie, it's about like 300 or something like that. And so if you parse that out over 80 days, it's like they are shooting 4 shots a day. That's how it looks perfect. But yeah, we're shooting 40 shots a day. And so, which is okay. I think this is the thing, is like we have to accept the reality of that, and accept that the final step of honing the image, like everything we do on set gets us 95% of the way there, all of our lighting choices and everything. But the final 5% has to happen in the grade. And that includes lighting. That includes like really honing in your contrast ratios on a shot by shot basis. And what's great about it is it's more efficient, because you're only doing that for the shots that are in the movie, as opposed to spending hours lighting a shot that's on the cutting room floor, right? So it actually, I do kind of prefer it, because it's a little more focused. But honing the contrast ratios, color balance, exposure, like all of those things. So all that to say is it's a really important part of it. We graded the creator for multiple, I mean, it was maybe 3 months, I think, was the whole process. And that does take fighting for sometimes, to make sure that you have the right amount of time to do that, and to also be there, which maybe I'm lucky, but I have not had to fight for that yet. I've always been there. I've always been included. Maybe you're not paid for every single second of it, like as you should, but you still get some sort of symbolic color grading fee that you just have to psychologically accept. Like, well, I don't know, just add that to the total of how much I was paid for the whole movie and parse it out a little bit differently. And maybe I made a little bit less on my day rate on set, but if you have to do that psychologically to justify the not enough amount that you're paid to be in the color grade, then whatever. But as long as you're there, and yeah, it's a process that starts in prep and bringing the colorist on in prep and having the post house involved, creating the LUTs together, looking at test footage, understanding the approach, understanding the look, and then continuing it through the dailies and continuing it all the way through to the final grade. And I do that on commercials too. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and it's less of a fight, but I will always make myself available to the agency, specifically because they're typically the ones who end up kind of facilitating post, and always letting them know, like, hey, no pressure, like I'm not demanding anything, but I would love to be involved in the color grading process on the commercial, just to make sure that it's, the best that it can be for you. Now, secretly, it's the best that it could be for me, but it's the best that it could be for you. And I will always try to recommend colorists and a lot of I'd say like maybe half the time I get it. So it's a pretty good ratio. And if not, then I will often just regrade the version of the commercial that goes on my website is not the client grade. It's like I'll kind of go in and redo it a little bit. It's not, it doesn't usually require a heavy lift, but so I would say overall it's a very, very important part of it, and it's very important to be a part of it and to make yourself available, and also to fight for it if you have to, which again, maybe I've been lucky that I haven't had to fight for it very much, but yeah, I will if I do, if I find myself in that situation.
What's the advice that you will give to a kid that is now starting to be a cinematographer, a young person who wants to be a cinematographer?
Yeah, great question. I think there's three things that I would say, and one of them is the most obvious one, which is shoot as whatever you can, as much as you can. But I will add to it, because I think people give that advice a lot, but I think I would add an addendum to it, which is shoot as much as you can, but with intention. So like even in early stages, like if you find yourself shooting something that isn't stimulating you or challenging you or putting you in a situation where you're doing something new or different or something you haven't done before, or something that's challenging you creatively, you don't have to do everything, or you don't have to feel obligated to shoot everything in that regard. And even more importantly than that, if you find yourself in a situation where you're working with bad collaborators or people who are mistreating you or who are just not creatively stimulating, that isn't really you're not gonna learn much from that except what to avoid next time, which is also a valid lesson, I suppose, but that's gonna happen whether you are intentional about it or not. So I think shooting whatever you can, but with intentionality is really key. The other one is, I do think that, going back to the question about aesthetics and taste and style, quote unquote, is there's a lot of DPs these days, and we've never had a more kind of saturated, competitive industry, which I think is a good thing, and it's a really wonderful thing overall, that various factors, including mainly I think the digital revolution, have like lowered the bar of entry for a lot of people who I think maybe had a hard time even thinking about pursuing a career in film or becoming cinematographers. And like, we now have the tools, much more affordable tools in our pockets and on our laptops and stuff like that, to give us access to that kind of creativity, which is a good thing. On the other hand, there's a lot more competition. And so the way to stand out, I think, is honing and finding that aesthetic and that look that isn't, it's not about style, but it's about like, what do you bring to a project that's unique and that somebody can look at and say, oh, there's something different or special about this person that's unique to them, right? That's like unique to your perspective and your aesthetic sensibilities, your taste, your past experiences, like the overall addition of all of these things together. And so being intentional about finding that and honing it and noticing it and looking for it in your own work and assessing your own work and looking back and saying, okay, what do I like about this? What don't I like about it? What do I want to try differently next time that would get it closer to the image that I see in my head? Do I even have an image in my head? Like working on all of those things, I think is really important, because that's what will end up separating someone from everybody else. And I think that is just kind of a necessity to have a career these days. And then the third thing is just studying imagery. Like I think you can't build that aesthetic taste without constantly exposing yourself to images and art, and not just movies, but also movies, because we're shooting films, so and commercials and music videos and TV. So you have to watch those things to understand the language, and it is a language. Film language is a language that you have to understand the vocabulary. You have to understand syntax. Like it works the exact same way, and you can't study a language without studying it. And immersing yourself in it. But also studying imagery outside of film, whether it's art, painting, photography, going to museums, or just going on a walk in nature and looking how the sun, shines through the trees and bounces off the ground. Like being intentional about all those things, I think is really, really important. So those are the three things I would say. And, and don't take Instagram too seriously.
That's
Yes.
number one. Yeah.
Nowadays, I think the next generation probably isn't even going to be using Instagram. So maybe that's less of a problem. Yeah.
Oh, this is fascinating. I mean, it's so great to get your approach on everything, honestly. We can sit here and banter all day long about how we would do things, but to hear somebody else outside of it, like,
Oh, well, it is fun to talk about, and sometimes fun to take a step back and like say it out loud, because it's stuff that at this point, I'm sure you guys feel the same. Like I'm not necessarily intentional about it. It's just how I do it. And so to take a step back and like assess it and analyze it is actually kind of good. It's like a moment of self-awareness, and hopefully it's helpful for other people, even though I think ultimately the most important takeaway is like everybody should kind of find their own way to do things, and will find their own way to do things, because one approach and method that you read about, that somebody talks about that works for them, you'll try and be like, this is dumb. This is, I would never do it this way. Like, what if I do it this other way? And I think that's exactly how it should be. So yeah,
it's like trying to put the Matrix LUT on a rom-com.
Right, exactly.
Right? Like, but work.
You got to try. You got to try, or you won't know.
You got to see that it doesn't work. Yeah.
Oren, is there something that we haven't talked about that you wanna mention?
No, I think this was really great. It was really, really fun chatting with you guys. Thanks for having me on to wax poetic about this crazy thing that we do. I'm happy.
We've got a great career. We should enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree. We're really lucky, and I think it's cool to be able to share that, and even just with each other, but also with anybody else who might find it interesting or inspiring. So yeah, thanks for having me. This was really cool.